Welcome to this explainer. I'm so glad you could join me today for formal, comprehensive exegesis of Genesis chapter 31. I invite you as a student of God's Word to join me in this really deep dive into the biblical text. We're going to be analyzing this chapter using a strict, literal, grammatical, historical framework. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, it means we're going to look closely at what the text actually says, how it was originally structured, and the precise historical realities in which these events occurred. Genesis 31 is just a profound chapter. We're looking at jealousy, ancient idols, divine dreams, and covenant stones, all gathered into a single awe-inspiring movement of God's providence. So let's dive into this text together and watch how the Lord proves himself totally faithful right in the middle of the fray. To keep us on track, here is the syllabus for today's study. We will begin with the historical and cultural background, followed by the biblical narrative flow. Then, we will look at systematic theology, maintain our boundaries by distinguishing Israel versus the church, and finally close with spiritual lessons and application. Let us examine the historical and cultural background. As we study Jacob's journey today, we first have to recognize that we are currently operating within the dispensation of promise. This is the literal pre-law historical timeline of redemption. Remember, the covenant was explicitly given to Abraham. It was renewed with Isaac, and now, right here in Genesis 31, it is being carried forward through Jacob. This family's movement isn't just some random migration across the ancient world. It is a critical, ordained step in God's sovereign plan to plant the heirs exactly where he promised they would be. A key cultural element in this chapter involves the teraphim. In the ancient Near East, these household gods symbolized family protection and often represented actual legal inheritance claims within a household. They were portable objects that misguided people relied upon for guidance and domestic prestige. Now, as we'll see, Rachel steals her father Laban's teraphim. The biblical narrator simply records the act and its concealment. The text does not explicitly explain her motives for doing this. And, as careful students, we must honor that biblical restraint. We need to leave her exact motives ambiguous, focusing instead on the striking, undeniable contrast between these mute, empty idols and the living God who actually directs human history. Let us examine the biblical narrative flow. The chapter opens with some intense, rising tension. Rumors are hardening into real danger. Jacob hears Laban's sons accusing him of theft, and he physically sees Laban's demeanor turning against him. But right in the middle of this boiling resentment, God's sovereign voice breaks in. He says, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." That's Genesis 31, verse 3. God's direct command interrupts the earthly danger with a rock-solid, deeply personal promise of his presence. Following this very clear divine command, Jacob calls Rachel and Leah out into the field away from listening ears. He lays out his case to them. He recounts his relentless labor, the 10 separate times Laban changed his wages, and crucially, God's guarding hand that protected him through it all. Jacob tells them of a dream where the angel of God identified himself as the God of Bethel and ordered him home. And in a moment of really rare unity for these sisters, Rachel and Leah agree. They recognize that their father has treated them like foreigners and completely spent their dowry. They urge Jacob to do whatever God has commanded. With family consent and divine command perfectly aligned, the caravan finally rolls toward Canaan. The departure itself is highly stealthy. Jacob deliberately chooses the cultural window of the sheep-shearing season. This was a time of intense labor and festivity that drew men out into the fields for days at a time, allowing Jacob to slip away unannounced. So while Laban is away shearing, Rachel steals the household gods, and Jacob, who is totally ignorant of this theft, crosses the Euphrates River, heading straight for the hill country of Gilead. It takes 3 days before Laban even hears of the escape. Once he does, he gathers his relatives and launches an arduous, forceful 7-day chase right across the landscape. But before Laban can finally overtake Jacob up in the hills, God intervenes. The Lord actually meets Laban in a dream at night with a very strict warning. He tells Laban to be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now, why does God do this? Because the Lord is putting a providential bridle on Laban's tongue. This divine formula completely bars Laban from using either the weapon of a curse or the snare of manipulation. It's beautiful, really. It proves that God actively guards his own, even stepping right into the very tents of those who oppose them. When the two camps finally face off against each other, the grievances are aired out, and Laban demands to know exactly why his gods were stolen. Jacob, again, entirely unaware of Rachel's actions, confidently invites a search. Tents are opened up like pages in a book. Laban searches thoroughly until he finally reaches Rachel's tent. Now, Rachel has hidden the teraphim beneath her camel saddle, and she claims she cannot rise because it is the manner of women with her. This is a culturally potent excuse that abruptly and definitively halts the inspection. The profound irony here is just inescapable.
The so-called gods Laban is so desperate to find cannot even protect themselves from being sat upon, while the true, living God stands absolutely sovereign over the entire scene. After the search turns up empty, Jacob unleashes 20 years of pent-up frustration and fiercely defends his absolute integrity. At last, the chase is replaced with a truce. They establish formal boundary markers. They gather stones into a heap called Gilead, and they set up a pillar called Mizpah, which means watchtower. This was a bilingual boundary covenant. You see, in the ancient world, in the total absence of centralized courts, these physical markers defined space and responsibility. They openly acknowledge that God himself is the unseen guardian and witness between the two parties, ensuring that neither side crosses the line to harm the other.
Let us examine the systematic theology context. Looking through the lens of systematic theology, we actually see three profound categories on display in this narrative. First, theology proper. We witness God's sovereign restraint of enemies. The living God actively rules human movements, exactly as we saw when he bridled Laban's tongue. Second, hamartiology, which is the study of sin. The text brilliantly exposes the sheer futility, the silence, and the absolute weightlessness of mute idols when compared to the God who speaks from heaven. Third, soteriology. We see God's preservation of the promised seed. Make no mistake, God is preserving Jacob not because Jacob is a perfect man, but to secure his overarching redemptive plan for the entire world. And this brings us to a really beautiful question regarding sanctification. How does Jacob's appeal to his own integrity demonstrate true character formation? Remember, this is Jacob we're talking about, the man who once actively deceived his own father to gain a blessing. Yet now, he stands before his relatives and appeals to a solid 2-decade record of honest toil. He bore the losses himself, he endured the blistering heat by day and the freezing frost by night. He doesn't swear by his own cleverness anymore, he swears by the fear of Isaac. This shows us that God's discipline under a very demanding employer has straightened him out. God is actively forming his heir while preserving him. Let us examine Israel versus the church. So, the crucial point for us as students is understanding the dispensational distinction before us. The God of Bethel summons Jacob to return to a very specific, physical piece of geography. God's program for national Israel involves specific earthly land promises, literal lineages, and physical boundaries. This must not be confused with the distinct, spiritual program of the church, which operates with a heavenly calling. While we certainly draw immense spiritual application from Jacob's journey, we must recognize that God's physical, geographical land program for Jacob's lineage is entirely distinct from his program for the church today. Let us examine the spiritual lessons and application. Here is what you should take away from this for your own walk. First, follow God's clear word despite earthly risk. Jacob moved because the Lord simply said, "Go back," aligning his whole household around God's call rather than his earthly fear of Laban. Second, keep clean hands and a clear record in conflict. Just like Jacob, choose truth over shortcuts so that your integrity actually becomes a shield. Third, renounce all subtle idols. Modern hearts still hide objects of trust, things like control, approval, or wealth, just as Rachel hid the teraphim. Leave them under the saddle and cling to the living God. And fourth, make peace with boundaries under God's watch. Healthy separation and clear lines, when entrusted to God, can protect our lives and our holy purposes from endless cycles of accusation. Before we finish, I want us to reflect deeply on the specific title Jacob uses for God, the fear of Isaac. Jacob places his oath inside a living, breathing family story of worship. This phrase powerfully captures God's awesome, majestic claim on a human life. It teaches us that a true covenant relationship with the Lord is not casual. It involves a reverent clarity that balances a familial closeness with an undeniable, majestic weight. Faithful allegiance to God absolutely includes both wonder and awe. We close our exegesis with a massive theological weight of Genesis 31, verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. This is just the ultimate testimony of God's justice and vindication. The Lord sees the unseen toil. He settles accounts in his perfect time, and he brings his people safely along the path of his promise. May the God of Bethel, the God who faithfully keeps his oath, guide your steps, grant you clean hands, and be your watchtower and protector this week. As you leave this study today, ask yourself, what subtle teraphim are you still hiding under your saddle, and what would happen if you finally surrendered them to the God of Bethel?
For more in-depth studies, visit the Grace and Knowledge series blog at woodybrohm.online.